Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Jacob Leclerc here with another reaction to another new week of Doctor Who, Series 14, or Season 1, or I suppose Season 40 if you're that type of fan. This week we have 73 Yards, written by Russell T Davies and directed by Dylan Holmes Williams. And I've actually been sitting here after finishing the episode for a couple of minutes, trying to collect some thoughts, because 73 Yards, it's kind of different from a decent chunk of what Russell T Davies has done before. Wesley Davis as a writer has a very specific set of skills. He employs some of them here, specifically in the second and third acts of this episode, uh, to great effect. And a lot of this episode is to great effect. The thing is I think this might actually end up being my favorite of the season, mainly because as an episode, it decides to be so different from what Doctor Who usually does. So most of these videos are not spoiler free. I'm going to give people just a little spoiler warning. I think this is one you may want to go into blind, because there is some effect, not because there's some great big twist. Actually, I kind of saw where the twist was going fairly about halfway through, which is fine, because this is again something out of the ordinary. Russell T Davies previewed this episode by saying it was Welsh folk horror, but I think that vibe suits it really well. There's a slight science fiction tinge to it, um, as well as generally crafting a world where Russell T Davies' anger at the political state of the world um, can be in full force as kind of a B plot. But the premise here, first off, this is the Doctor Light episode of the season. It's the first episode filmed, and Ncuti Gatwa was, in fact, away filming Sex Education for much of it. He really only appears at the beginning and the end. And essentially, the big twist of this episode is that it's kind of in this liminal time loop space. And I say liminal because, well, that's what a lot of the episode feels like. It feels liminal. Something is completely off. The entire idea is that the TARDIS arrives in Wales. The Doctor steps on a fairy circle, disappears, and Ruby sees this woman a certain distance away, and no matter what she does, this woman just keeps following. It's an incredibly unnerving setup, drawing on quite a lot of ideas initially, and then building on those ideas, mainly by having any character who goes to talk to this woman who isn't Ruby, this woman is specifically 73 yards away from Ruby the entire time. And in doing that, anyone who goes to talk to her immediately becomes terrified of Ruby and makes Ruby's life harder. And of course, the Doctor's gone. The TARDIS is inaccessible, mainly because you can kind of tell that I think in post production, some of these episodes maybe were their order altered. Ruby gets a TARDIS key at the end of Space Babies and doesn't seem to have it here. But that's a very tiny nitpick in sort of what this episode is doing as a piece. The episode also doesn't have a title sequence, which is a fascinating decision. A friend of mine suggested that that could be for time reasons. It seems that these are trying to sit in a below 50, in at most a 50-minute time slot because they are also airing on BBC One as well as airing on streaming, which is very possible. But I think it actually works. It helps set up the atmosphere of something just not being quite right. Something is off. But I also think 73 yards largely works because it actually remains ambiguous as to what happened. There are these references in the fairy circle to a mad Jack that has to rest in peace, and that eventually comes back later with a politician in the future that the Doctor actually mentions in his opening monologue as the worst prime minister who nearly brought the world to nuclear destruction in the 2040s. Because, yeah, this episode ends up following essentially the rest of Ruby's life on Earth. Her mother abandons her because Carla ends up talking to the woman. Ruby finds herself on her feet eventually before meeting up with Unit, who abandons her because they engage with the woman with a brief appearance from Gemma Redgrave as Kate Stewart. And then Ruby decides to get involved in politics because she becomes convinced that whatever this entity is, it's meant for her to take down this man who's going to take the world. And as that plot builds, Davies pulls a trick of works. The woman is still there. She is still there at 73 yards. So Ruby has to finish living her life. Already seen some criticism that this could have been a two-parter to make the actual life living part and flesh some of these ideas out. And while I agree, I'd also fear that it might weaken just some of the ambiguity. I think a lot of this episode is working so well because it remains ambiguous. We don't get an explanation. There's some maybe hints that we might get some sort of an explanation near the end. There's a brief appearance near the start of the episode by the actress Susan Twist, who's been popping up, and Ruby nearly recognizes her, or thinks she does. It's not quite clear intentionally so. But Ruby's clearly putting pieces together that we've at least seen someone who looks very much like Susan Twist before. I'd imagine specifically the ambulance in Boom being the most likely candidate, due to that's the one that Ruby saw the most of. Um, but what I think works here is that ambiguity. It's asking questions and making you sit in this discomfort of, you know, always being seen and never actually getting a full explanation. The explanation is there. It's Ruby from the future, some always watching, potentially on her own deathbed, but we don't know how it works. And I think that kind of works because it's something that you can't understand. There is something weird in some things in the universe are just weird like that. And I quite enjoy when we can delve into the weird and the wonderful. Now, outside of that, we actually do have some fantastic performances. First off, Millie Gibson as Ruby Sunday, who, while I've been enjoying her performances, I think this was the episode that she kind of needed, largely to define her character. There's a lot of defining about her series, her feelings of isolation due to being adopted. Like, there's this clear idea that she loves Carla like a mother. She loved Cherry like a grandmother. The tragedy of being kicked out of the house and the locks being changed because of something is affects her so greatly. But I think Davies is also smart by giving her a characterization that there is still this wish of knowing who her real mother is. Just to know, still that nagging suspicion. In a way, you could argue that older Ruby, our figure in the distance, represents that in a way, that nagging, uh, and that, interesting idea. Uh, but, it's not entirely there. It's like one of those potentially interesting ideas. And the actual tense scene, setting up uh, our human villain, for lack of a better term, Roger Ap Gwynn, played by Aaron Barnard. Barnard giving a great charismatic performance. He doesn't actually quite get fleshed out in the script. What works so well is that it's very much shot well and shown so that there's this understanding of who this character is, what he stands for. And there's this very brief moment during an interview where he lets slip that he essentially wants to blow up the world, um, and is essentially a warmonger. Um, and although we don't actually get any sort of uh, any sort of explanation as to his motivations, it works because that's kind of the point. Uh, a lot of this point is dealing without explanations. I'll also say the first third of this episode and the back two-thirds are two very different things. The first third actually is the most traditional horror, uh, being in an isolated location, having a small cast of characters, and the script and Williams' direction of the episode specifically plays into that. There's this entire sequence where these people have gathered in a pub and they essentially play a joke on Ruby, playing about the idea that ooh, you've let Mad Jack loose onto the world, and in doing so, you've you've created something different. One of the characters in the plot is played by named Sean Phillips, who's giving the best performance in at least the best guest performance, at least in my estimations, at least the most fun and enjoyable guest performance of the episode. Largely because Phillips as an actress just has such a presence, and um, she plays the role of sort of this almost off-kilter old woman so well. Um, Also, because we are playing with a little bit very briefly, we start to play this idea of heighten the isolation. We briefly play with the idea that it may not be the present day anymore. Uh, Early on, they may not have landed in the present day. Um, and then, it's these little things where then they get to reveal, okay, it was the present day, so you relieve the tension that way. There's these nice, just these little releases of tension, but never fully releasing in a way that makes the tension of the episode work so well. Again, this is also just very much a genre of horror that Doctor Who hasn't done very often. I suppose at least in terms of folk horror, the stories that come to mind are Pertwee's The Demons and The Awakening. But even then, those are very different types of folk horror. Um, I don't entirely know if Davies is going to be revisiting any of the ideas here. He might be because there are hints that Unit has been combating the supernatural um, since we last saw them, um, which is makes sense. I like that Davies is going supernatural with the series and letting some of that aspect of the universe work so well. But yeah, 73 yards is just it's fantastic and it's weird and I really like it. I might give this one a 9 out of 10, I think, but I think that score again, scores are usually subject to change. This is just a first reaction. What do you think of 73 yards? Let me know in the comments. If you like this video, leave it a like, subscribe if you haven't already. Follow me on social media, and if you want more of me, you can check out my blog where I write reviews and my comics podcast where with my good buddy Joey Morgan. And I will see you guys next time.